Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7th, 1952 in Leningrad. Vladimir's father, also called Vladimir, was a factory worker and a former soldier who fought in the siege of Leningrad. His mother Maria gave birth to two sons who died before Vladimir was born. At first, the family lived in a communal apartment that was barely big enough for them, let alone the other two families they had to share it with. As you might have deduced from all of this, Putin grew up in poverty and would get into fights around his apartment building, a habit that would land him in trouble as an adult and even risk jeopardizing his career at points. This habit would also lead him to channel that energy into Sambo, a Russian martial art that combines catch-as-catch-can wrestling with judo. Putin would later practice judo proper, and it is one of the things he is known for on the world stage. As for education, Vladimir did not get good grades at first, but the chance to join a sports club to learn martial arts inspired him to improve his mind as well, along with another motivation to improve his marks, which we'll get into shortly. He also learned German in school, which would likewise greatly influence his trajectory later. What may come as a surprise, given where he's ended up, is that Putin was politics averse as a youth. For example, he declined to join the youth wing of the Communist Party, even as he was pressured to do so by teachers and fellow students. However, Putin would eventually relent and find that he was a natural leader. One thing that he was far more interested in, even as a child, however, was spycraft. As a teenager, he dreamed of joining the KGB, inspired by approved literature and film about Soviet spies during World War II. There circulates, whether fully accurate or not, a famous story where in 1968 a teenage Putin walked into the KGB headquarters in Leningrad and asked a guard what he needed to study in order to get into the KGB. The guard told him he should study law. Allegedly emboldened by the response, Putin started to put more energy into school, hoping to enter Leningrad State University for law, and ultimately achieved this goal. However, he was warned by his coaches and friends early on that he would not enjoy the more realistic life of a KGB officer compared to the one he saw in films. Still, Putin persisted, and his studies in university instilled in him a great respect for law and order. He ultimately interned for the city's transport ministry in its criminal division until he wound up getting recruited to the KGB in 1975. In 1976, Putin became a first lieutenant, working for the KGB's counterintelligence department, the Second Chief Directorate. Here, he learned how to recruit informants and collaborators in the war with the Soviet Union's internal enemies. As much talk of deep states in modern conspiracy theories, but the KGB was truly a state within a state. It monitored everything to ensure law and order within and without the Soviet Union, and Putin learned a lot from his time working for them. The without part is something Putin would become more familiar with, as after 6 months he was transferred to the First Chief Directorate, which handled intelligence outside of the borders of the Soviet Union. That said, while you might envision Hollywood spy-type scenarios were his daily life, in fact, according to journalist and biographer Masha Gensen, quote, Putin and his colleagues were reduced mainly to collecting press clippings, thus contributing to the mountains of useless information produced by the KGB. Nevertheless, his employment in the KGB brought out a side of Putin that would become central to his rise to power. He worked. He worked hard, meticulously, and he kept his head down. He had ambitions, no doubt, but they don't appear to have been initially to rule the country or party, but rather to advance in the KGB. For now, he monitored and shadowed foreigners in Leningrad until 1985, when he would be sent to the Red Banner Institute for training in foreign intelligence. This was the real spy school where he fulfilled his childhood dream. However, his fondness for fighting continued as an adult, with the consequence that his conduct there resulted in him being unable to get into the Secret Service. Instead, he was assigned to Dresden in East Germany because of his knowledge of German. There he worked with the KGB and the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, during the last half-decade of the Eastern Bloc. There he immersed himself in German culture and by all accounts performed his duties with distinction. The unraveling of Eastern Germany, which was most dramatically captured in the fall of the Berlin Wall, impacted Putin deeply. He saw the Soviet Union's reach in the area crumble before his eyes, and Moscow unable to even relay simple orders to the KGB amidst the chaos. In 1989, he returned home to Russia. Due to Gorbachev's social and economic reforms like glasnost and perestroika, the Soviet Union's days were visibly at an end at home as well. Putin didn't know what the future held for him, either as a Russian or as a KGB officer. This was not unique to him, as for most Russians, the future was uncertain. A way of life was coming to an end, and there was a lot of chaos in building a new one. While still working for the KGB, he was assigned the position of assistant to the rector at Leningrad State University. This was a semi-official KGB post used to spy on foreign students. And now into the picture, Anatoly Sobchak, a professor of law at the university and would-be democratic reformer. Sobchak recruited Putin in May of 1990 for his elections to the city council. In this, Putin disclosed to Sobchak that he was an active KGB agent, but Sobchak did not mind. He ran for city council and then chairman of the city council. He wished to establish free elections for the post of mayor as part of his platform of democratic reforms. The hope was that a referendum could be held in which he would be elected mayor and the city would be renamed its original name, St. Petersburg. And that's exactly what happened in 1991. In all of this, Sobchak trusted Putin as a reliable worker, and soon he would reward him. Also during this period, Putin tried to quit the KGB twice, as his active status with the agency attracted too much scrutiny. The first time he tried to quit was in the beginning of his tenure with Sobchak. He tried again during a failed coup in 1991. However, the KGB were only too happy to have him in Sobchak's midst. They even tried to lean on Putin to supply them with a document which would allow them to manipulate Sobchak, which Putin refused to provide, not wanting to violate Sobchak's trust. His resignation was ultimately accepted and he was officially out of the agency that had served for most of his life. Now, going back to Sobchak, his time as mayor did not go well. The democratic reformer became known as anti-democratic in his dealings with the city council. He often tried to shut them out of important decisions, kneecap his rivals and any challengers to his mayorship, and he was accused of numerous under-the-table dealings. Putin also was not immune from this seemingly shady behavior. In fact, the first rumor that Putin was using a government position to stash away quite a lot of money for his own personal gain came around this time in his then position as head of the Committee for External Relations at the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. Specifically, when he allegedly helped broker a $93 million deal to acquire various food supplies for the city. In a nutshell, various companies were granted permits that would allow them to supply huge amounts of materials to foreign entities, and in exchange, they'd be given an equivalent value back in foodstuffs to then be used within the famished city. The thing was, as far as anyone could tell, while the companies did send out the materials, no foodstuffs came back in return. The matter was ultimately investigated by one Marina Salyi at the behest of the city council, with Salyi in turn claiming Putin's signature could be found authorizing the deals. She states, "The raw materials were shipped abroad, but the food didn't materialize. There's 100% proof that in this, Putin was to blame." As a result, in 1992, when there was no food at all, the city was left with nothing. The evidence I have is as solid as it gets. Putin, his committee, made bartering contracts to get food for the city. He issued licenses, and commodities, wood, metal, cotton, heating oil, and oil flew out of the country. That said, while she states Putin was to blame, and at least according to her she had definitive proof, she did not find any evidence that Putin had received anything in return for the apparently botched deals. As for Putin, he claimed that the companies that had been given the export permits in the deal were to blame for the foodstuffs not coming back as they were supposed to have, implying Putin had no knowledge the deals wouldn't be completed as originally brokered when he issued the licenses. The city council would move forward with further investigation, but ultimately Mayor Sobchak put a stop to it and the matter was dropped. While you're reading many outlets reporting this story, that Salyi would die of so-called natural causes mere weeks after she made these accusations and the investigation was killed, in truth, she would go on to help found the Free Democratic Party of Russia and more or less continually rail against Putin to anyone in the media and the public who would listen, until eventually giving up in 2000 after the election and moving to the countryside. There she lived until her death at the age of 77 in 2012. Although she still did give a handful of interviews during that span, still unabashedly anti-Putin. In any event, going back to his rise to power, Putin was linked to the federal government of the new Russia under Boris Yeltsin's administration. Sobchak and Yeltsin were friends and shared a lot of the same economic ideals that made 1990s Russia a tumultuous place. Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy was an attempt to shock Russia's economy into rapid capitalism. In the end, it also encouraged a lot of corruption and rising crime. And speaking of seediness, Sobchak's regime in St. Petersburg attempted to change the city into a Russian Las Vegas. To help him in his various ventures, Sobchak gave Putin the position of deputy mayor. This is when we can ostensibly say Putin entered politics. Putin was supposedly surprised at the promotion, but he accepted the new duties. He used his knowledge of the German culture and language to travel to Germany to foster connections for the mayor there. Putin claimed these visits changed him as he got to see West Germany for the first time and how it was so different from the former East Germany. During this time, he also researched models for casinos and in the process saw an erotic performance that shocked him to his core. This was the unfettered lust and vice of a world without strict Soviet discipline. He also came to the conclusion that if such vices were to be allowed in Russia, the profits should go to the state. Sobchak tried to reshape St. Petersburg into this image, but along with the rest of Russia, crime came calling. Corruption with these casinos was high, and the government itself was not making the types of profits from the casinos as expected. But organized crime, and presumably many of the politicians themselves, were. Organized crime became such a huge problem that contracted murders and assassinations became common. This issue gripped all of Russia, with no clear way as to solve it given the power structure and the chaos. Reporters blamed Sobchak and his inner circle for the corruption. Some of the blame even landed on Putin. However, while Putin did get paid a little more than he was at the KGB, his property remained modest for his position. Like many things in this story, this could be an attempt to clean Putin's image in the wake of his later success, and rumors swirl that his public property didn't exactly match his actual total earnings when factoring in earnings under the table, something we'll get to in a bit when we discuss how Putin accumulated his wealth and how much he actually has. Whatever the case, Sobchak did not escape scrutiny the way Putin might have. Tell-all books were published by former allies and betrayals were common. Many former deputies and aides started running against Sobchak in elections while accusing him of countless improprieties. Sobchak did not help himself either. He was focused on improving the city in all the wrong ways. He brought Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, Ted Turner, and other international figures for political and economic visits, some of which Putin oversaw in one of his many accumulated positions. Some of these visits led to misguided attempts at diverting business to the city, like Ted Turner's Goodwill Games. The games were a mismanaged disaster for St. Petersburg. However, any opposition to Sobchak from the council was met with undemocratic resistance from Sobchak, who would use his control of the city's TV channel to block rivals from having as much screen time as himself. In 1996, Putin's fellow deputy mayor Vladimir Yakolev ran against Sobchak as mayor. Sobchak had his back against the wall, and Putin was allegedly horrified at Yakolev's betrayal. In the end, Sobchak and Yakolev made it to a runoff election, which Sobchak lost. Upon his loss, an official investigation into Sobchak caused him to flee Russia. However, Putin's experience with Sobchak had made them friends, and Putin had developed a loyalty for those within Sobchak's circle and for the man himself. From this, he supposedly developed a bitter hatred for those who betrayed Sobchak. Putin's fierce loyalty and lack of forgiveness for betrayal are something the future president would come to be known for. Another trait Putin picked up in this time working for Sobchak is a distrust of the public and a growing hatred for the reach of journalism. He saw their attempts to hold officials accountable as something that got in the way of the government's work and its progress. Putin also embraced Sobchak's attempts at privatization of markets and companies the Soviet Union once controlled. He was also party to some of Sobchak's mistakes in dealing with newly privatized assets, as was all of Russia during this time of transition. Whether this was deliberate corruption on his part or growing pains is debated. However, with some who have been exiled by Putin and little reason to lie about it at this point, claiming that while Putin was no saint, it was more of the latter growing pains, as we'll get into shortly when discussing how wealthy he is these days. Whatever the case, in all this, he learned the inner workings of the government, albeit on a municipal level. Even then, Sobchak gave him very high responsibilities, such as dealing with foreign dignities. This was a natural extension of his KGB training and time in East Germany, but it is something he would carry forth with him to the federal level. Putin gained a lot of knowledge under Sobchak. He learned not so much how to gain power, but what to do with it, and the many ways that it can be lost. With Sobchak's career finished, Putin found himself jobless again. However, his work with Sobchak put him in the orbit of Boris Yeltsin's people. Boris Yeltsin's Russia was not going well. It suffered a lot of the same issues St. Petersburg suffered under Sobchak. The rapid transition to a capitalist economy opens the country to rampant corruption and crime, with many politicians seeming not too upset about this given the opportunity for their own advancement. Yeltsin also dealt with two major issues Sobchak did not: an unpopular war in Chechnya between 1994 and 1996, and ailing health, which saw Yeltsin disappear from the public eye on occasion. He was, at this point, still the Federation's first president and was constantly worried about a safe transition of power. He also knew Russian history was not kind to former rulers or their families, so picking a successor with a thing for loyalty and who was able to keep him and his family safe were high on his list of qualifications. On this note, Yeltsin's Moscow had a thick atmosphere of mistrust by the time Putin fully entered that world. And this brings us to August of 1996, when a member of Yeltsin's cabinet called Putin to Moscow for an interview. The opportunity fell through, but instead of returning to St. Petersburg with nothing, Putin found himself working for Pavel Borodin of the Presidential Property Management Directorate. He worked as Borodin's deputy, and it was more or less his job to purchase the Soviet property that now lay outside of Russia's borders. From there, in March of 1997, Putin was placed in the position of Main Control Directorate. He was given authority in investigating how government money was being spent and to end government corruption wherever he could find it. From this new position, he discovered just how corrupt and damaged the Federation was. He also became respected for doing his job well and returning government control to sectors that had gone rogue due to corruption. His outsider status, competence, and staying out of the Yeltsin inner circle drama allowed Putin another promotion. He was appointed to director of the FSB, the KGB's successor. This was an attempt by Yeltsin to control the more old-fashioned leaders of the FSB by appointing someone who understood them but was loyal to him. In this position, Putin guided the FSB through some modernizing reforms that reflect some of his later interests, such as monitoring the emergent internet. He also worked to corral the old guard, reshape the FSB to Yeltsin's demands, and even deal with a torrent of scandals dealing with the Kremlin, the FSB, and tensions in Chechnya. Because of all of this, Putin was once again rewarded for his diligence. On August the 5th of that year, Yeltsin would tell Putin, a man who just a short time before was relatively unknown to the wider public, of his plan to appoint him as prime minister. Being prime minister was more than a big deal. It was the ticket to the presidency. Yeltsin was worried about his own health, and on top of that, he had a habit of firing prime ministers. Putin, the aloof yet competent outsider, showed none of the signs of machinations or overt visible corruption of the previous prime ministers. Yeltsin wanted a stable picture for whom to leave the country to avoid the repeated fates of Russia's previous rulers. On this note, he also sought a successor who would guarantee the safety of his family upon leaving power. Putin's reputation for loyalty preceded itself on that one. He was the perfect candidate. Putin supposedly did not want to accept the position at first, but he eventually folded to Yeltsin. He was also put in charge of the Security Council in March of 1999, something he would hold on to even after he became president. During this time, the Second War in Chechnya started when rebels invaded the neighboring Republic of Dagestan. This war thrust Putin into a repeat of the mid-90s. The people feared an unpopular and bloody war. However, in his stint as prime minister, he proved to be more effective in leading the war than Yeltsin was before him. As a result of this and his other work, he became popular as prime minister. His successor firmly in place, at the end of the millennium, Boris Yeltsin resigned as president. This put Putin in the position of acting president, but he would have to run for election after 6 months, which he did, winning as his predecessor had hoped. From here, Putin held on to power with little difficulty. However, in 2008, after 2 terms as president, he faced a dilemma. The constitution only allowed 2 consecutive terms for any president. To overcome this obstacle, he had his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, run for the presidency. Medvedev won and appointed Putin as prime minister. In reality, Putin held the real power and was subsequently re-elected in 2012 back to his old position. As for his presidency, Putin's outlook changed over the years with a pronounced conservative turn, starting with the ongoing tensions in Chechnya in 2004. Putin also became an ally of the Russian Orthodox Church as a byproduct of this turn. As with countless politicians, whether true or not in any given case is a matter of debate, but his asserted Christianity is often a talking point in his appeal to the people, emphasizing the importance of family and Christian values. Whatever the case there, Putin is often accused of scheming in his presidency to keep his inner circle in line and himself in power. On this note, it is speculated that he was in a rather good position for this, given his rise from the lowest ranks to the highest. Once he reached a state of power as president, he had a good understanding of how Russia worked from the municipal level all the way to the federal level. He also knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, for all the people all the way up the chain. Further contributing to his maintaining of power, he saw the way constitutions could be manipulated. Putin believed more in the letter of the law than the spirit of the law, and any constitution in Russia did not have the same semi-scriptural status that, say, the American Constitution has. In the end, Putin's time with Sobchak showed him just how malleable constitutions are. On his own, Putin developed the idea that stability was more important than freedom, a position he has carried forth increasingly into older age. As previously alluded to, he has little love for journalists. His curtailing of the media is well known, and it largely stemmed from his time rising through the ranks. He saw media and journalism as an obstruction to the government's workings and making rapid progress, either because enterprising individuals would use the media to their advantage, whether what they said was true or not, or journalists would poke their noses into sensitive business that may hinder something ostensibly overall good for the people. Even Putin's long connections to the oligarchs did not shield some of those who ran media companies that stepped on his toes. Such is the case of the oligarch who owned NTV, which, after being critical of Putin, was given to a more Putin-friendly oligarch in 2001. Controlling the media with an iron fist is one way to stay in power, but it's not the only way. As such, Putin maintained countless connections that he made in his career. Like elsewhere, these connections remained important in Russian politics, but they were leaned on more heavily as social currency. He understood this and developed and maintained numerous such associations, even as he reached the top, continuing to keep a large core of allies loyal to him among those below him. Part of this social currency is loyalty and punishment of betrayal, which Putin took extremely seriously. Loyalty was rewarded, such as helping out Sobchak during his legal troubles heading into 2000. The system of connections is how he keeps the oligarchs in line. As long as they don't get involved in politics against him and do support him, they're more or less free to operate how they want. So what about the infamous assassination attempts that the regime is known for? Shootings and poisonings were never something Putin was known for during his time with the KGB. He denied ever committing crimes for the agency during his political rise. If anything, he had experience investigating hits and assassinations during his time with the FSB, rather than him being the one to order them. That said, it's probable he trained in assassinations at the Red Banner Institute, and it is noted that the assassinations of people like Boris Nemtsov, Boris Berezovsky, and the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny helped protect Putin's regime. Of course, whether he was directly involved or simply the people who have an interest in keeping Putin in power just take care of it for him without consulting him, is a matter of debate. Moving on from there, Putin also values the aesthetic of the old Soviet Union over its ideology. He appeals to a nostalgia of Russia's central place in the Soviet Empire, but he is no communist. One of Putin's famous quotes is, "Anyone who doesn't mourn the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wants it restored has no brains." On a domestic level, Putin offers a form of continuity between Soviet and federal Russia that appeals to many hardliners left over from the Soviet days, while also courting those who enjoy the freedoms gained during the Federation. This is especially true for the Orthodox Christians. He also appeals to nostalgia for the Russian empires of Peter and Catherine the Great. This plays into the fears of republics like Chechnya breaking away. Such breakaways are feared to trigger a domino effect of independence movements that would weaken Russia and the pride of the Russian people. The pre-Soviet legacy hangs heavily on Putin. After all, he took part in changing Leningrad back to St. Petersburg. He often struggles to keep land that was gained during Imperial Russia, such as the Caucasus republics. On an international level, his Soviet nostalgia is less assuring for former Eastern Bloc and Soviet republics. The presence of Russians in many of these countries and the claims of former Soviet lands have opened these countries to invasions and excursions, of which there were the wars in Georgia and Ukraine. Putin uses the spectre of the Soviet Union and Russia's past as an empire to fuel the drive forward for a modern Russian identity. In the end, Putin is a complicated man who rose from almost nothing to heights of power few in history have achieved. Like him or hate him, he has been and continues to be one of the most important shapers of the 21st century, and his presence can be felt more now than ever with little end in sight. Although, unless he is really one of the lizard people, he's probably not immortal, so at some point in the next couple of decades, he'll probably shuffle off this mortal coil, and perhaps then, like Gaddafi, more definitive data will be revealed about his wealth and his conduct while in office. Or perhaps sooner, if he eventually loses the protection of his position and the vultures swoop in to pick clean his political corpse.